Okay, so we just ended the last little segment talking about Christ's true nature, human nature and divine nature, and then how that might relate to us, how we partake of his nature, and how at least in the end we'll leave it as he did take on human nature, and total divine, and in no way was the human nature corrupting his divine. All right. So what we miss sometimes, and it's interesting, I kind of did a search on the internet for this, and I was finding a lot of Protestant sources, which made me happy. It was about how Christ received his the human nature from Mary, because I understand on some levels. I grew up in a little Italian community. I know what it must have looked like from the outside when we were all running and pinning dollar bills on the Virgin Mary being carried by guys in suits. I understand that, okay? What's odd about it is it never had that meaning for us, but I think if I were looking at it from the outside, I probably would have the same meaning they did. Or to see the ladies' auxiliary, we call them the Blue Army. They went and found those big styrofoam balls, and somebody made a 100-foot rosary, and they're carrying it down the street. And then you're thinking, well, what do these people think about Jesus? So friends of mine at the Metagons, right? Well, why is your statue for Mary bigger than Jesus? Almost like somehow that, determined, the status, that you would go, well, because she's more important, And what's with this Fatima statue, right? You have Mary there, and you even have little statues of girls kneeling down in front of them. It's like, well, we can't always worship her, so we get statues to do it for us. I mean, that's what it looks like to them, right? So it's hard for us to take all this in. So I was quite, relieved when I was reading all of this Protestant theology on how, this is Mary's role. This is where Christ received his humanity. I have to tell you, although I know that intellectually and I knew it in the past, I don't think I thought of it recently. That's not something that I keep thinking of these little things, and I try to make notes. That's something when I'm in prayer, what did that mean? I mean, how beautiful was that it's through Mary that, we as a people contributed the human nature to God. Because let's just face it, God with just a blink could become a human. He doesn't need the vehicle, right? I mean, he could have came any which way he wanted. So why did he choose it that way? Maybe I was talking earlier about Carl Sagan. Maybe that would have been an issue. Why didn't you make it so evident? Probably because, this would have reduced our wills, wouldn't it? I mean, if Jesus really did come as the conqueror and the magic man. Do you remember, here's my point on this. Do you remember in the Bread of Life discourse when Jesus was being followed across the sea? He was trying to get away from them. Do you remember why he was trying to get away?
This is a hard saying.
Well, that came a little bit later, but that's something that. That's something that. But before that, though, because that's when they left him, all right? This is when Jesus is trying to get away. Because he had multiplied the loaves. He didn't do that yet. He had healed them all, and they were following him, and he knew they were following him. Maybe he did multiply the loaves at that point because of what he did. And they were trying to make him a king, and he took off, right? And the reason being is that wasn't what he wanted. In other words, I think he knew that I have the power with a thought just to heal everybody within a radius of me. But then what would I be? I'd be the magic man, right? And what's interesting about what you just said was people will say that that's not the Eucharist. In other words, he's not talking about the Eucharist there, which is really odd because John, is not one of the synoptic gospels, right? So John's the spiritual gospel, and he's the one that doesn't mention the Last Supper. So this is his treatment on the Eucharist, right? But they'll say that when Jesus said, "I am the bread of life, I am, the body. If you don't eat of this body, you will not have everlasting life." And he repeats it, right? So you get to the point then where he says, "My words are spirit and life." And then that's where some of the Protestant groups chime in and go, see, he's saying that my words are just, metaphorical. It's just an analogy. But the problem with that is after he said that, and that's when they left. In other words, if they would have left before, And then Jesus kind of said, whoa, wait. My words are spirit and life, a.k.a. my words are just, metaphorical. Then they probably went, oh, okay. But if that was his reasoning, and then they left afterwards, and then the reason why they left was his sayings were too hard, but in the Greek, the word is scleros.
There you go.
And it doesn't mean too difficult to understand. It means this is too hard to accept. So we still have that division, don't we? So that's very good because, I don't know anybody's brought that up. So good for you, Rose. You get extra points. I don't know what they would do with them, but if there's points, you should get extra points. All right? So anyway, Mary provided what we would probably call the material cause, right? And we know that Jesus in his divinity was what we call the efficient cause. This is what made it happen. But it was Mary that provided the human matter for this. So, obviously Mary is not, just like we are not, the origins of our children's souls. We provide the material, but the soul comes from God. And you notice, just talking about the human person, that you never say, this is how you say, I'm the mother of my son's body. You don't talk like that. Nobody would talk like that. This is my son, because he's himself is an incarnate being, right? So another little thing for us to keep in mind, all right? All right, so Jesus' encounter, our method of encounter with the human person is relationship. In other words, let's see what they have here. This is from Evangelium Vitae, so this is Pope Francis. Let me read a little bit of it, because I really haven't read anything they provided. I'm giving you my commentary. It says, Jesus encounters a person in his fullness, body and spirit, and will touch him or her without fear. It says, at this time, and this was June 16th, 2013, he says, today's gospel brings us another step forward. Jesus allows a woman who was a sinner to approach him during a meal in the house of a Pharisee and scandalize those who were present. Not only does he let the woman approach, but he even forgives her sins, saying, her sins, which are many, are forgiven, for she has loved much. But he who is forgiven little will love little. So Jesus is the incarnation of the living God, the one who brings life amid deeds of death, sin, and selfishness, self-absorption. Jesus accepts, loves, uplifts, encourages, forgives, restores the ability to walk, gives back life. Throughout the Gospels, we see how Jesus, by his words and actions, brings the transforming life of God. This was the experience of the woman who anointed the feet of the Lord with ointment. She felt understood. She felt loved. She responded by a gesture of love. That's a gift of the self, right? Sometimes, let's face it, like if you can remember back when you first met the person you fell in love with, it's hard to really frame that experience, right? It was almost like there was something that was greater than you that had to get out of you. That must have been the woman who just experienced that love and acceptance and then just started anointing him and then crying and wiping his feet with her hair. So it says she left herself to be touched by God's mercy. She obtained forgiveness and she started a new life. So, in other words, Jesus meets us where we are. The first example they have is the woman at the well. So, what's important here is, Jesus, again, it's his initiative. So he goes out to somebody who's on the fringes of society, in this sense, the society of faith. So they were outside of the idea of salvation, and yet Jesus goes out to meet her. And if you know the story, it's wonderful. He says, I am there to draw from the well. And she says, well, okay, it's a deep well, and you have nothing, so what are you going to do? And then I think, if I remember right, how was it? He said, if you knew who it was that was asking you, you would rather ask me for water. Now, again, we got to go to the Greek because the words are different here. One water is like still water. The other that he talks about is zoe. It's the flowing water. In other words, so we miss all that in the Greek because all we see is the word water, but it comes up differently. So this is an encounter he has with her. And then, he says, well, go and tell your husband, I don't have a husband. So you can see the humility and everything. But it's an encounter with Christ. And in the end, what happens to this encounter? She wants to follow him. And he says, no, you need to go back. It's almost like your mission is there. It's like, in a sense, we're called the church militant for very good reasons. Just like the army and the services, will say, you go here, you go there, you go here, we too. Which is maybe why we may need to be more humble sometimes. Even those that aren't of us that aren't in a consecrated or religious life, we don't necessarily have a superior that could give us assignments, but nonetheless we have to be very pliable to the will of God. So it's just one of those texts where he reveals himself to her. I am he who is speaking to you. Because she says, one day, Jesus says, look, you guys don't worship what you know. We worship what we know. The Messiah is going to come for us. And she says, well, one day he's going to come and he's going to explain everything. And then she says, and here I am in front of you. Now, what's interesting is that we're in Lent now, right? So everybody that's coming into the RCIA program, does anybody know what to refer to right now? This is like catechism quiz. This is for extra points. Can you do it, Rose? Right, they start out as a pre-catechumenate. Then when they formally are in, they're catechumenites. Right. But once they hit Lent, they are now the elect. All right. So we're done with not permanently, but we're done temporarily with the catechesis. Now we're in this discernment process. So you guys know what the scrutinies are, right? This really has nothing to do per se what we're doing, but it's interesting to talk about us as the human person. So what will happen is, as we get into, I'm going to get this wrong in my mind, third, fourth, and fifth, or fourth, fifth, and sixth weeks of Lent, right, we have these scrutinies where, and there'll be two presentations. They'll be presented with the Creed, and they'll be presented with, I want to say the Our Father. This is really on the cuff here. That's right. 3 sacraments of initiation, right? We have baptism, and the next one is confirmation, the Eucharist. So it's baptism, confirmation, and the Eucharist. That's the original order. So what they have then is they have 3 Gospels that line up with those. So no matter what cycle we're in, if you go to your Mass that has the scrutinies, they go to cycle C, and you're going to hear John's Gospel, okay? So when you hear about baptism, that's why I'm thinking of it, that is the Gospel you will hear. So this is the Gospel that's connected to baptism. When it gets to confirmation, it'll be the man that is born blind outside the temple, okay? When it gets to the Eucharist, it'll be Lazarus being risen from the dead. So what the people who are being scrutinized in themselves, they're supposed to relate. I am going to be baptized like this woman at the well. I'll have an encounter with Christ with water. I'll have an encounter with Christ where he'll anoint me. I'll have an encounter with Christ where I'll experience the risen. Now here's the beauty, and this is probably why it's okay that I brought this up, is that sometimes, okay, I don't know about you, but I don't remember my baptism, but I'm pretty sure Jesus didn't baptize me. I'm pretty sure it was at my place, Father Faracek, okay? When I was confirmed, I could tell you what bishop and such. So, that's not Jesus doing it. It's how I think, right? And probably how you think. So we kind of feel on some level we got the B and C string in there, I mean, could you imagine what it would have been like to be the woman in the well, or the man born blind, or Lazarus being raised from the dead? How cool would that have been? Because that would have been Jesus himself. But here's the idea, is that it's the same Christ who transformed that woman at the well with that encounter who's going to transform that individual in baptism. The same Christ who met the man born blind in his state is the same Christ who's going to anoint. So the same Christ who said, Lazarus, arise, is the same Christ who will give you his body. So we don't get the B string. We don't get the C string. We think that way, right? Like, why do you get the priest and got the deacon? That kind of thing. Why don't I want to receive communion from him, the lay minister? I'd rather go over to the priest, like it's going to be better. That kind of thing. So we always think in those terms, right? Because we're a respecter of people. We're told not to be. So in this sense, this is an encounter of Christ, and what it did is it totally changed her. It was a transformation. In the end, that's what we're talking about. Transformative power. Then the encounters of the young rich man. So I already led into him a little bit. Here is the young rich man who says, what must I do to have eternal life? Which is the question, the existential question. Perhaps the only real existential question. And he says, keep the commandments. And again, well, I've done this since I was young. Then go and give everything you have. And come follow me. And the man left sad because he had many possessions. So just think of those 2 different encounters with Christ and the 2 different outcomes. One woman just yielded and said, I want to come with you. And the other one, there was a stumbling block in his way, and it was his possessions, which we can talk another day on riches. We did that once, right? We did a social justice class. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah. So an entirely different encounter. Now, we don't really know what happened down the road with the young rich man. I would like to think that that was the seed planted in him, but for our sakes, this is the information we have. Same thing with, I won't go into any deeper, with the three wise men, right? So they came in one way, and then we're told don't go back because Herod wants to know where this young man is too, so he can come and worship him. Of course, we knew to kill him, so they went back a different way. So an encounter with Christ changed their path. With Zacchaeus, the short little tax collector, right? He climbs the tree because he can't see Jesus, and Jesus says, come on down. And they start to make fun of him, like, hey, come on, this is the King of Kings. He doesn't even know who he's talking to. This guy's a thief and a robber. So what was Zacchaeus with this? This is his encounter. This is what we're trying to focus on, our encounter with Christ, and how it reveals who we are as human people. That's really where we're going with this. So what does he say? He says, I'll tell you what. I'll give half of everything I have to the poor. And anybody I defrauded, I'll pay him back 4 times. And then he invites Jesus into his house. That's a different encounter.
Jesus invited himself to his house.
Well, you're right, he did. He let him in. You're right, though. Because you're right, because it's always his initiative. Thank you, Rose.
And there's a difference.
She gets 3 more points.
Yeah.
This would be like Harry Potter. What was that? Like those different houses got points, like Gryffindor. I always you get 3 points to Gryffindor. All right. And same thing with the man who was healed. The man, the demoniac, the guaranteed demoniac that was in the cemetery outside of town. He was throwing his shackles off. Jesus goes to him, and we all know the story. Eventually, the demons legion are put into the swine, and they go over the hill. But he tells, this man too wanted to follow Christ, this encounter. But he says, no, you got to go into the towns. Tell them what you did. Now, I mean, let's just face it. We're now getting in, if you haven't picked up on it, we're getting into the mission, of what we do with this imaging. So, in other words, where are we at? I mean, following Christ, and that might sound odd, like don't follow me, go into the town, but we know that that's what his mission was. So we are being sent out. Unfortunately, anybody that's involved in CCD, too often 8th grade see, I almost said it. 8th grade confirmation is graduation, right? It's almost like now I'm done. And this is where we're empowered and supposed to be sent out. So we're trying to think, how do we now image him in the world, and what kind of signs are we with other people, all right? So Jesus knows the human person, and this is important. This really came not just from John Paul II, but this is a philosophy known as personalism. So they say here in the outline about a personalistic norm. What does that mean? Well, personalism philosophy is that the person is always the ultimate reality. He's always he's always an end in himself. In other words, your dignity and my dignity is so great that I can never use you as a means to another end. This could be in corporate work. This could be in mocking, like if I want to feel better about myself, so I'll diminish you. This can be in human sexuality. So the kids are often surprised when I say, when you say you love somebody, what is the opposite of that? Like, you don't love them, so what do? And they say, well, I hate. I say, no, it's not the opposite of love. Okay, if love is to do what is best for that person in total self-sacrificing gift, then the opposite would be to do what is best for you at their expense. So when you think in terms of, well, how far can we go, like with sex, till it's a sin? I said, you need to stop thinking in those terms. I said, how about if I ask you this? How far can you go using that person for your own pleasure? Why don't you answer that question, not out loud, to yourself? That's a different, but, it's hard for us to not think in that terms. Today, I do this journal 3 times a week with the kids that was done by Dr. Rhonda Chervin. And I'm going to get this published. She had done it. Do you know Rhonda Chervin? I'm very good friends with her.
I love her.
Oh, do you?
I don't know her, but I've seen
Well,
her
you know
on
what?
television, and I think she's the greatest.
Well, oh my God. Well, we're going to get a picture of you saying that, and I'm going to send it to her, because I'm very good friends with her. She's a wonderful lady. She now teaches at Holy Apostles Seminary in Cromwell, Connecticut. She was born an atheist Jew I think in Brooklyn, and eventually came into the church. nonetheless, she's been on EWTN.
Oh, lots of time.
Sure, but she wrote a journal called The Way of Love, Step by Step. And she asked me to do it from the male point of view. And then, so that's what I'm working on now. So anyway, today on the journal with the students we're into generosity, the theme of generosity. And how, getting money. Okay, this is always the hard one, right? I mean, when I do human sexuality, people might roll their eyes. When you start talking about money, now you're getting people pissed, that type of thing. So anyway, just without going into that journal, what I was meant to say was, I remember, God, years ago, one student saying, Mr. Bueno, I bought a pair of sneakers for $300. Do you think that was a sin? Well, it took me a minute to think about how in the heck anything costs $300 as the sneakers. But I looked at them and they looked pretty fancy. But nonetheless, I said, okay, well, can I ask you not to think of it in those terms? I said, right, because then we're going to ask, well, how much can you spend? And that's going to be the next thing, and you're going to try to come up with a figure. And that's not the way to do this. So let me ask you this. I said, let's forget about the government and everybody else taking care of stuff. Let's pretend that you have control over your own finances. Can you get a nice pair of sneakers for $60 or $70? I knew the answer, but I was waiting for them to say. They said, well, sure. Is it possible that if somebody, I'll just pretend it was birthday money. Let's pretend, it was a heck of a birthday, but let's pretend you had birthday money and you said, rather than $300 sneakers, I'll buy the $80 pair and I'll use 100 of it. I'll keep some back and use 100 of it to do what I think is good with. I said, I'm going to leave it to you to think, is that a better way to image Christ in your life? And I'm not going to sit here and give you an answer to your question. So, that's how we have to start thinking. It's a little bit different approach, but it gets us away from the legalism of, what may or may not do. Because then, we start thinking, what is the least I need to do to go to heaven? And as I tell the students, could you imagine going to band or like a theater group or going to football and just telling the coach, what's the least amount I need to do to make the team? That would probably disqualify you from the onset, right? So let's not start out by saying, what's the least I need to do to go to heaven? You're imaging the creator of the universe, for goodness sake. That type of thing. Anyway, so a man is never a means to an end. He's always an end in himself. It's known as the personalistic norm, all right? So as far as healing, it's always the whole person. When those people encountered Christ, we're not always talking physical healings because, they all died. But at the time, they were transformed. Even, because healing, especially physical healings, are always for the other person. Lazarus being raised from the dead, he didn't live forever. He died again. And if dying is a bad thing, he just did it twice. So was that a favor? Well, it wasn't for him. It was for a community, right? So we have to think of we're being transformed in this in ways that we don't know. And again, this is for the kingdom. It's not for our own sake. All right, so these physical healings, which they list as Lazarus, the blind men, the lepers, the emotional healings of Martha and Mary, and the spiritual healings of Mary Magdalene. All of these, Jesus encountered them in their own freedom, and he just offers an opportunity for a conversion, which is a wonderful thing now that we're in the year of mercy. I understand in the Allentown Diocese they're going to have a 24-hour period of confession, reconciliation.
The dates are set.
They're all set?
In the AD times what they're going to
Oh, okay, so it's all set and ready to roll. So, we understand that, for us, reconciliation is a re-baptism, right? You can't be baptized again, but it brings us back to that state. So, it's always, this is the mistake of the modern world, though. They understand tolerance as acceptance rather than to endure. So, if we are to love, let's say, a homosexual behavior, they're saying, well, we should love the person and we should accept them. Okay, because, didn't Jesus, and they'll say, when the woman who was in adultery, didn't he say, if you're without sin, cast the first stone? Well, yeah, he did say that, but we often forget that before he left her, he said, no, let's go and sin no more. An encounter with Christ cannot leave us where we're at. So again, I use the example of the homosexual person, but I can use the example of a person like myself who might at times find myself attracted to other women. Again, part of us is we are rational and we don't have to cave into our instincts. That's what makes us different than the other animals. So, that's the beauty of us. And that free will, because let's face it, I always ask the kids, if you had the ability to make somebody fall in love with you and submit to you unconditionally, would you like that? Well, they all laugh and like it. I said, but how long would you like it? I mean, science fiction. I mean, if anyone who watches the Twilight Zone marathons that go over New Year's, right? There's always one or two of them that show. I remember one about a guy can, speak into a tape recorder or something. It was and then a woman would become real. Well, after a while, you realize this person is programmed for you. So there's no love. There's nothing there. Well, that's the same thing that Christ wants for us. Freely come with us. Which ironically put us in a situation to begin with, right? Because Adam and Eve, he had to give that freedom to them. Without that freedom, they were not truly imaging him. So, in other words, we image him. If we're not free, neither is he. It goes, it reflects back. So then what? Is he by his, if we say, well, he can't help it, he has to love us. Well, then what are we? I mean, then we're not truly wanted for our own end. That personalistic norm goes out of the window. We have to be loved for our own sake. We just have to understand that this love has to be more than a sentiment. That's really what we come down to. All right? So no one remains the same. They say we already said the three kings go back another way, the woman at the well, the young rich man. And this all culminates in the Paschal mystery, right? So we saw that in the first Passover. So just real quick, without getting into it, because I wanted to finish up with a few other things. But we know the parallels, right? There had to be an unblemished lamb. The lamb had to be sacrificed or destroyed, let's put it that way. We had to eat the lamb. And then the blood of the lamb over the lintel saved us. And that obviously lines up with us now in the Paschal mystery, which includes the passion, death, and resurrection. So we look at that as one event. So what happens on the cross was not separate from what happened at the Last Supper. This was one single event. We have a hard time with that because we're very analytical and we're very sequential, and we like to see part 1, part 2, part 3. But in the Jewish mind, it was much more fluid, so they could understand it in that way. So when we hear Jesus uttering things on the cross that don't seem to make sense, like it's finished, but what's finished? I'm thirsty. Really? I mean, you just got beat to a pulp, drug across how far, got nailed to the thing, you're put up, it looks like you're ready to die, now you're thirsty? So theologians will say, well, this is the end of the Passover. So when he says it's finished, he's talking about the Passover. But if you understand what the Seder is, there were things that were missing from the original, from the Last Supper, that now can be completed. When he says, I thirst, it's the cup of I guess it'd be the final cup, the cup of consummation. Okay, so, we understand, but it only makes sense if it's one event, all right? Which, by the way, just as a little FYI, if somebody says to you, how is it that you eat the bread and the wine, which comes from the crucified Christ, but yet you say at the Last Supper at the institution of the priesthood, he had not died yet, so how could you possibly have they been eating his body and blood? Of course, he was standing right there or sitting right there. Okay, well, again, it's because you don't understand this as one event, So it's all how we understand these things, really. And, and what's interesting is how willingly Jesus sacrificed himself. He made himself available to suffer and die for our sake. So we see that that's the ultimate act of love. And then, not only that, but in his dignity, he says, and I want you to share in it. So all the pains, all the sorrows, all the grievances that you have in your life, all the discomfort, bring them to me. And at Mass, when we say, accept this sacrifice, at your hands, because the priest says, accept our sacrifice, that's ours. So he's saying, unite it with mine. So as feeble as ours are, as impossible as they are to save us, again, if you add 5 to infinity, you still have infinity. So if that's Christ, if he infinitely did it, yes, obviously we can't add anything that's efficient to what he did. That's impossible. But what we can do is we can still contribute. And I'll give you a real quick idea of this, because I think this is important for how we understand sacrifice and love. Maybe another woman you saw on EWTN, Rosalind Moss. Does that name sound familiar? Rosalind Moss?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, Jewish convert, okay? She converted
Big time.
She converted to evangelicalism first and then came into the Catholic Church. A big hang-up of hers was this. If what Christ did was sufficient, then and we don't need to add anything to it. And so that was it. There was forget about adding to infinity, you don't need to add anything to it. And she says that when it dawned on her, one time when her child, I think it was her child, was young, they were in the kitchen, and her daughter said, "Mom, can we make cookies?" And you know what it's like to get a kid involved in that. Flowers all over, sprinkles all over the floor. I mean, just forget it. Unless you got a dog who's sweeping for the next, 10, 15 minutes. She said, I realized at that moment, I knew how to make cookies. I was absolutely sufficient for the task. But what does love do? It extends the invitation to the child who is making a real contribution, as feeble as it was, without diminishing the fact that I was sufficient for the task. And once that analogy opened up her eyes, she got it. So it's a good thing to keep in the back of your mind. So anyway, ultimate act of love. All right, so here's what I want to do before we call it here. When we're out in the world in our lives, again, if when we image him, if evil presented itself and identified itself as evil, even those that are weak amongst us would probably have the wherewithal to resist, because we would recognize it, so knowledge is part of it, and then we would resist. But the problem is, it always shows up subtle. And when it shows up subtly, it's almost impossible for us to discern between these goods. So in the world, we're rarely choosing between a good and an evil. Okay? It's not, should I go and help my neighbor or should I kill them? We never are talking in those terms. We're always choosing between competing goods. And both of them are good, so we can say that there's something about them that is true in its nature. But one is more counterfeit, and we buy into it a lot easier than the genuine good. So I just want to real briefly line those up, because it gives us a glimpse into what it's like for us with our mission in the world. It's not part of the text. I didn't see in the textbook. This comes from a philosopher named Tom Morris, but nonetheless, the list does, and I put definitions to it. So in other words, wisdom, wisdom, as I defined it just for this, was how we can direct our mind to judge all things in accordance with this principle of self-giving. But we don't really look for wisdom as much. We look for its counterfeit, which is really cleverness. So in other words, if a person is really good with, say, marketing, right? Perhaps, I'm just making this up, we need to charge more for this product. Okay, well, how about if we drop it from 10 to 8 ounces and make the package bigger? Most people won't see that. That's clever. Okay, but wisdom would have a hard time doing that. Wisdom would want to communicate that somehow because they feel that, you're being misled. We can talk about politicians. We can talk about sports people. We can talk about anything, even our own relationship between husband and wife. How sometimes the person who tends to be clever gets the nod. So in that book that I said to you, Ted, C.S. Lewis would say we often, he has a part that he calls it the men without chest. In other words, we're so smart these days, our head looks so big. Well, the truth of it is our heads aren't any bigger than they ever were, but our chests are so much smaller. Our heads just look a lot bigger. In other words, if we want these qualities in people, we have to start demanding them. We have to stop giving in to the counterfeit good. So that's the first counterfeit good that he came up with. Wisdom and its counterfeit is cleverness. So rather than dignity, rather than saying it's rooted in our humanity and all people possess it, we oftentimes will submit to glamour. All right? So the people that maybe are the bigger people in the room, or they're more flamboyant. Maybe we are a respecter of people. Maybe we will opt for the person who's dressed nicer. Maybe we'll think that person's more intelligent. So there's certain ways, in other words, there's nothing necessarily evil about glamour itself. But if we accept it as a people over and above dignity, that the person doesn't have to do anything. There's nothing that's shallow about the person. Because that's all what glamour is, right? Glamour is something that we see very shallowly. We get into it too easily. He then goes on to say, rather than seek truth, which means that we know something as it truly is, we seek expediency. So we like the quick fixes. Nobody would have premarital sex if they didn't look for the expedient over the true. Nobody would probably go into debt that they couldn't handle if they weren't looking for the expedient over the true. We probably wouldn't buy one-line slogans from politicians if we weren't looking for the expedient over the true. In other words, if we want politicians who have depth, we have to start demanding that from them and not buying into slogans, which, by the way, if you ever had an opportunity to study logic, are fallacies because they can be interpreted most ways, you know. In other words, you know, if somebody were to say, for whatever cause they're having, you know, it's love that matters. Well, who's going to argue with that? Of course, I don't really know what it means. You know, what are we talking about here? You know, well, I think that, you know, people in homosexual relationships, it's love that matters. Oh, I thought you were talking about adultery. I thought that's what you meant. I mean, we don't know. I know it only works when you have it to fit your mode. So it's very appealing when we hear, you know, could be businessmen or politicians throughout these slogans, but they don't have a lot of meat. That's why oftentimes they're not. When they say a fallacy in themselves, but it's the way we understand them. So we have to stop trying to cave in to people who are expedient and really ask people for truth. Like this, rather than beauty, we give into the counterfeit of titillation. So this very shallow type of pleasure. And you could really see this in the arts. No more do we have, you know, beautiful imageries of, you know, statues and paintings. I mean, literally, I saw the other day, I don't know if it just happened the other day, but I just saw it the other day, that a modern art museum had a potato that sold for $1 million. Or you have paintings that I don't really care. I mean, I'm an artist, by the way. I mean, I have a degree in art. This is what I've been doing for 20-some years. I just don't buy when you put up a few colors and put a red dot in it. I have this video of an art teacher who shows a close-up of his apron and doesn't tell the students that and has them all give them something. Tell me something, critique this piece. And he says they put up things like it's evocative, it's random, but yet, you know, sincere. And then he shows them the real photo and he says, it's my apron. And everybody says, but I can't blame them, you know, it's the emperor with no clothes, right? So I don't know if any of you had the opportunity to go down to the Franklin Museum. They have Vatican Splendor there. It was beautiful, you know, a lot of the stuff that came from the Vatican on art and display. You know, what are we going to do in, you know, 500 years? What are they going to look back on? Boulders and potatoes? Or a crucifix made out of plastic in a jar of urine? Or it was a woman dressed, I think, as a police officer bending over peeing? I mean, so in other words, what are we at now? We're at shock value. You know, I want to be in your face. What do we do with comics, right? Like, somebody was talking about a comic called South Park, and I said, look, I'm not a prude, but I don't have the stomach for it, and I'm not even going to repeat the episode that I saw, somebody showed me, but I said, you know, you see comedians and comedic shows, the closer, the less talented they are in getting their point across, the more titillating they have to be, the more they have to use vulgarity. Same thing of movies, right? Even mainstream movies, if it's a weak plot, we'll put a nude person there, that'll sell it, all right? But we have to stop buying into these counterfeit goods, okay? Rather than goodness, we've gotten to the point where we ask people just to be nice. But, I asked the students, what is your view of being nice? And they were pretty good. They said it's temporary. That's right? I didn't think about that. But when you're telling someone to be nice, you really need just stop. Right now, be nice. It's quite temporary. And it doesn't necessarily say anything about you as a person. It's pretty much like putting a dog on a chain, you know? In other words, I need you to stop hitting that person. I want you to be nice. But if we can really work towards goodness, this is something that's much more deeper in the human person. And the last one was, rather than developing character, we really have cut ourselves up into big personalities. So we're sold with the guy who makes a statement. We're sold with the guy who fills the room with energy. And no longer do we really think about character and how it develops. Now, my name doesn't carry any weight, but I remember growing up, maybe you heard it too, you know, don't give us a bad name. You know, it's not that my name was, you know, known outside the 3 or 4 blocks of my hometown of Berwick. But that being said, you know, my dad said, I didn't do anything my whole life to screw it up. And I don't want you to do that either. Well, that's character. It takes time to develop. It's something that has to be earned, really, and it has to be preserved. But personalities, you know, they're drive-by. So, in other words, this is our problem in the world. And you can apply tons of examples to that. But too often we buy the counterfeits. In other words, we say we don't like men without chest. We don't like men without virtue and heart. But yet we always give deference to them. They're the ones that always win. They're the ones that always get the job. They're the ones that always get our attention. They're the ones that get our vote. I mean, not you or I, but, as a people overall. Oh, there was one more. I'm sorry. Rather than reputation, you seek fame. All right? Which pretty much, is not that different than one of the other ones. But nonetheless, it doesn't have to be nurtured and developed. We're not talking about the sum of a person, okay? So anyway, what I want to end with, and then we will be done, is prayer. Because this is really our weapons in the end. And I've always, have you heard the acronym ACTS? It's quite popular, ACTS. It's just a good formula. This was another individual that, back from the 70s, he kind of fell out of grace, but his name was Father John Bertolucci. Acclamation, contrition, thanksgiving, and supplication. Okay, so you start out by saying something good about the Trinity. You acclaim them. Oh Lord, the wonders that you do. In the skies, I see your work. In people, I see your image. And then, contrition. Lord, forgive me for the amount of times that I have fallen short of the image of myself. Forgive me for the amount of times I have not recognized the beauty out in the world. Thanksgiving. But I thank you. I thank you for sending your Son to reconcile us. I thank you for sending your Son that he can, encountering me, can help me see the world better, see other people better, and then supplication. Lord, give me strength, be with me, all that type of thing. Now, it's funny, when I teach the kids to do this, I teach them to think in terms of if they want something from their parents. I said, if you walk into your house and you say, hey, Mom, I need $5 to go to, I can't do that anymore. Mom, I need $15 to go to the movies. Come on, give it to me. I do so much around here. You really think you're going to get it? I said, but if you walked in and said, Mom, all the things that you do, I don't even know how you do it. I'm sorry I don't do the dishes more. I'm sorry I don't clean. I really am. I'm just so thankful for you and the love that you show. Dad, come on. Mom, I know in spite of all this, can I get $15? I said, and I'm not going to say your parents are going to give it to you, but you're going to have a better shot at it, right? I said, so it's not that we're trying to use this to manipulate God, but yeah. What was the one time a student, and it was your brother's class. It wasn't him, but it was your brother's class. I was telling them how we're not contemplative enough. We get, in other words, what are the enemies of education and spirituality? Well, it's apathy, I don't care. It's dullness of mind, I don't understand. Or it's anxieties of life. I'm just so busy doing everything else. So he went home and literally got an email. They knew I was joking. I knew they were joking. But he went home and tried to talk his mom out of why he should not be mowing, because he needs to contemplate God in the Trinity more. I can tell you who it is afterwards. But he'll probably wind up being a very successful whatever, But nonetheless, it was pretty good. So I got an email from his parents saying, my son contemplates God just fine. I told him to go mow. Okay, so we pray without ceasing. Okay, so my good saintly mother can sit in a chair for 4 hours and pray, and that's terrific. I can't do it. I can't even make it through Mass without mimicking what the priest is saying. It's the only way I can keep my head in the game, right? So what I have, what they call it, OCOS, obsessive compulsive, shiny. I don't last. So how do we pray without ceasing? And this is something else I never understood. So when I was young and played football in high school and college, you should be out there, and what you should be doing should be a contribution to God, and your talent should be a gift to God. And I mean to tell you, it may sound stupid, but I didn't know what to make of that. Do I make a really good tackle and say that's for you? Do I make it a good catch and say that's for you? I didn't know what on earth that could possibly mean. It wasn't for quite some time afterwards. I'm glad I didn't share that with too many people, because they would have thought I was an idiot, all right? But there's different types of different types of prayers, blessing being the first, and it all comes out of the catechism, right? So the first one is blessing. And this is the one that's the easiest to use. So we say we're praying without ceasing. This is how we do it, right? So a blessing is that it's God's gift, and it's man's acceptance, and they're united. Okay, so now in sports, if I do have certain athletic prowess, or kid, and I'm then using that not to beat that person in a competitive mode, but in essence to be the best athlete that I can be, that, at least at that state in my life, is God's gift, meeting me, and then I'm using that as a blessing. So in life then, like I have a daughter who's very empathetic. She wishes she was less empathetic because sometimes these people take on the sorrows of the world. I don't share that as much. I'm much more goal-oriented. I can go do this, I can do this, I can do that. Well, you need those people too, right? So whatever it is, if you're a good teacher, if you're a good manager of money, if you're a good nurturer, let's face it, and we're not just one of these things, right? We have multiple roles and levels of these things. These are all blessings. So the entire, if you are very good at, maybe seeking out the people as a teacher that are not getting this lesson, and you can relate to them, that's prayer, okay? That's prayer. So that could be one way how we pray without ceasing. The other is adoration. Adoration is defined as acknowledgement that man is dependent on God, and we're simply the creature before his creator. Now it's often marked off in silence sometimes, right? But when we're sitting before the Eucharist, now I'm fortunate that we have a chapel here and that we have the Eucharist in the tabernacle and repose, so I can come in every single morning. I just go over for 25, 30 seconds, and I say the same prayers. Does anybody pray the Liturgy of the Hours? Okay, there's one prayer. Yeah, well, if you pray the Liturgy of the Hours, you get a little frustrated because they send you back to week 1 for every little solemnity and everything. So if you get tired of saying anything, you get tired of saying, "Oh God, you are my God, for you my soul is thirsty." So, but you know what? I kind of made fun of that in my heart for a while, and isn't that the one thing that I say every single morning now? So the joke's on me. But nonetheless, you're sitting and you're realizing, this is Eucharistic adoration. I am a creature before this Creator. But I think that's not just limited to Eucharistic adoration. We can find adoration in other ways. We're not pantheists. We don't see God in a tree, but we realize that somehow God's love sustains that tree. Okay? Praying without ceasing. Now, petitions. We're very good at this one, right? We're asking, we're beseeching, we're pleading. But it does express a relationship, In other words, even in our petitions, we start out by, forgive us, be merciful, these are works for the coming of the kingdom of God, and we're praying for every need. So, I had a priest growing up, and he was he was so didactical in my mother would go to every single morning mass, every funeral. She would think, okay, it's the same 15 of us every morning. Do you have to repeat why you're doing everything? And we hear this over and over. But one thing, he would always say is, like the Father likes signs, or I didn't write it down, but I'm thinking what else he would say. Oh, he likes to hear what your needs are. So we can almost think that just like parents want to know what their child, what that communication, this is part of that too. So we're not there with our wish list. It's not that, shallow, but the needs that we have in life. And sometimes they're the needs for strength, right? Like, I can't go through this anymore. Now, I'm very vocal. It's part of me. It's how I learn. I learn visually, but when I speak, when I have to repeat stuff. My one daughter, who really, in a non-comical sense, images me. It's like, with my 3 kids, you know which one's mine, and the other 2 are my wives. You can just line them up perfectly. The one went into the same field I am, and the other 2 are going to the field she was in. And I hear my daughter out there studying, and she's like talking the whole time. And I'm like, I'm trying to watch TV. Will you stop talking? It's the only way I can learn. Well, that's how it is for me. So sometimes when I get a little overwhelmed, now I have a large pottery shop where I can go down there, and I can be by myself, and I can walk around and I can talk out loud to God. I much prefer that. My mother always told me she did that. She said that she would talk, like, to her guardian angel all the time, and she would yell. So if like Italian ladies, they get mad at these saints, right? And they're like, you better do what I'm asking of you, this type of thing. I've had a devotion to you long enough. I said 3 novenas. Where in the heck is this thing? That kind of stuff, right? And also she would say, I always talk to my dad, and my dad has passed away since '91. She goes, I always talk to him all the time. Charlie, what am I supposed to do here? I don't know what's going on. So I keep telling her, I said, that's fine, Mom. I said, because you have a real incarnate relation with the angels and with Dad. I said, just make sure the blinds are down. You live on a corner, for God's sakes. They're going to send somebody over to get you. But I picked up on that. So, I, not in a spiteful way, but I can get mad at God. In other words, challenge him. Yeah, so I'll walk down in my shop and I'll start walking around. I can't do it. This is ridiculous. I'm not saying I got a heart than anybody else, but you gave it too much for what you gave me. So you got to match whatever the fortitude with what you gave me, and I can't do it, or I'm not doing it. You start to have the relationship, right? He's always going to engage you, and he's going to, you're always going to wind up on the short end of that, because he's going to say, fine, I'll give you the strength, now do it, and shut your little pie hole, that kind of thing, I like to think he talks like that, but nonetheless. Okay, so that's another way, petition. Then we can do intercessions, right? This is to pray as Christ prayed on behalf of other people. So, and this intercession has to know no boundaries. So here we find ourselves praying for those that we are not in close relationship with. And, we can't pray that lightning strikes them down. We just pray that. And it's okay to pray, I don't know what to do with this person. In other words, I don't like the schmoozing they're doing, or whatever it is. I'm tired. It's not that I want the recognition that they get, but it's not right. It's an injustice. And if you're a God of justice, you've got to do something about this. So, okay. What does he usually say? Change me first. Give me the heart to change. Because unfortunately, it's been my experience that God says, I want you to go to him. Maybe you're right. So go to him. And he sent people to me. And we know how this is all reciprocal. None of us are like the saints running around here. So anyway, it's another way we can do it. Another way is thanksgiving. It's just simply recognizing all the things that God has done for us, and they're good things. They're characterized, this is the prayer of the Eucharist, right? So this is the prayer, the Eucharist is our way of giving thanks too. So every talent and every need that we have, we can be thankful for. In other words, we can't see far enough ahead, right? We have to watch using a spirituality, like we can say, and rightfully so, that Jesus knows what's ahead. But we can't. So sometimes we might say, well, it's all for his will. Well, okay, not really. Let's face it. There's been a lot of bad things happen. If a kid, falls away from his parents and goes in and starts doing drugs and such, and then hits bottom and comes out of it, we're not going to say that was God's will. We're not going to say God willed that person to get hooked on methamphetamines. That's not how things work. But God will take us wherever we're at, right? That type of thing. So at least we can say he will take whatever is there, and then he will make the good come from it for our sake. Now that's very true. But also, it's not that different than us who are very limited in our intellect and our knowledge. We know with the younger people, you don't have to be, what do you want to say, you don't have to have a crystal ball to know if you continue that behavior or you keep doing that, this will be the outcome. Sometimes it's quite obvious. We're not 100% right, but we've got a decent idea. Okay, now we have a God who's an infinite person. It says, look, you're getting into this addictive behavior, or you're starting to have this cynical attitude, or you're starting to do this. It only leads this way. So sometimes we have to yield to that, all right? Anyway, and then in that, so thanks. Thank you for the clarity of that, all right? The last one is praised. This is simply recognizing that God is God, and he does so for his own sake. So when, maybe you've heard the distinction between the Catholic and the Protestant Our Father. There is no distinction, right? So when we say, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against evil. That's the end of it. Even the new Bibles will say, nothing after that appears in the Greek. That's what Christ said, all right? So what happens then is, and this is the irony, so some of the Protestant groups, not all, but some of the Protestant groups will say that we chopped off the last part. The irony is they got that from us in our liturgies. In other words, as soon as that was done, there's what the priest has, what's known as an embolism prayer. I can only do it if I went back and if you deliver us from evil. Yes, Lord, deliver us from every evil and keep us freely in our day. He puts an embolism in there. And then we then respond with the doxology. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory. So somehow, somewhere, we're guessing that was written in the margins somewhere, or it came out of the liturgy and somebody put it in with the prayer proper, and there you have it today. But nonetheless, this is our way of prayer and of praise. So in all ways, if we follow through these things, and it's not just, we always think of prayer as simply sitting down and reciting something, or simply sitting down and asking for something, but all these things really can be prayers that we can continue without ceasing. And the difference between that is it puts us all in a different mental state. So it's not just a psychological thing on us, although it is. I mean, you know, we are psychosomatic, right? But it also, it builds communication, and that's what love does. There was something I real quick wanted to say, and right now it's totally gone. That's probably the Spirit sparing you from a story that doesn't make any sense. Oh, no, I'm going to tie. Just remember, because it is pretty good. And then we're done. Okay, so one point in my life when I remember it just, nothing was going right. Okay, now, it wasn't like anybody, you know, had cancer, so nobody was dying. But, you know, that's not always the worst thing in the world. Sometimes the lack of hope is a really thing of great despair. So with rising medical bills, with a diagnosis that was not then known of my wife, but it was very, very bleak, with finding out that one of my daughters, which she still doesn't know, she'll never listen to this, they had spots in the lung. I thought it was tuberculosis or something. I was losing, I was not being able, with where I was working, to even pay the bills. I come home, and part of my roof in a windstorm had blown off. I walked down to my pottery, and my kiln looked like it might take thousands of dollars repair before I can, you know, it's like an oven, right? If you're a baker, you don't make money until the bread comes out of the oven. Well, it's no different than a guy like me that does pottery, right? And this is not a little kiln, this is big industrial kilns. And I was a beaten person. I really felt that, right? So I'm walking up the hill. So this is the other thing. This was the Spirit. Now I'm remembering what I was going to say. Formal prayer is really important when you can't always be on, you know. Sometimes that's all you got. And that's why even priests will say that with the ritual of the Mass. They can't always be so inspirational. Like if they had to come up with their own words. How many times we were sitting there going, oh my God, can't they just read something? That was terrible. So you can't, so formal prayer carries you through these moments, right? So that's how I always thought. So the Our Father. So I started praying the Our Father. And I got to the part where it said, give us this day our daily bread. And literally he stopped, and I didn't hear anything audible, and the sky didn't open up. But he told me quite clearly, you have never meant that ever. And I thought, he's right. I mean, let's face it, how many months or years of bread do we want? You know, we've never asked for today. We want enough that I can, you know, can I put up my silos so now I can eat, drink, and be merry? Well, that guy in the Bible died that very night, right? So, you know, wasn't that their pissing and moaning going through the desert when they were in Exodus? Because they only got enough manna for the day. They didn't even have anything left over to collect it. So they had to rely on him for the next day, right? So, you know, now in my particular situation, not all, I mean, I'd love to tell you everything just worked out fine. It didn't. But for the most part, you know, a neighbor happened to have a few things of shingles, so we were able to fix that. And the kiln, I don't know what happened, it did start working. I'm not going to say it was miraculous because I just don't want to buy into it that easily, but it could have been. But nonetheless, it was working. The other things, well, you know, something did come of it, but, you know, we live with those things. So, you know, for me, you know, this is where it's at. You know, I would have loved to snap my fingers. I would love to be able to believe in a God that could simply snap his fingers and make all those things change and fix. But I wouldn't know, is that for my good? We teach in morality about end-of-life issues. And one thing about an illness is that not only does it usually put us in a good place, but oftentimes it heals parts of the community around us. There's some reconciliation going on. The person themselves finds themselves, not always, right? But you start to find peace amongst yourselves, and you start to accept it. And you're in a state of grace. And a healing at that moment might be something we think we want, but it may not be the best for our eternal souls. In other words, you know, if we are healed and then told to go sin no more, how do we know we're not going to? How many times have we made promises with God? You know, deals. Please heal my mother of this. Please heal my brother of this. You know, please, Lord, if you let me pass this test, I swear to God I'll be a priest. You know, whatever it is, we make these deals, and then as soon as something clears, we're like, okay, I didn't really mean it exactly like that, you know. So, I mean, that's our part of the weakness that we're in. So how do we know in illnesses? So we look at these illnesses, we look at these special needs childs, we look at these chronic pain, we look at, all these things, and we can only see the evil in them, and then we forget that we had a God who suffered. And by his incarnation, and then eventually through his passion, death, and resurrection, he gave meaning to suffering. So now these things have something, and Dr. Ron Chervin wrote a book called Kisses from the Cross. So every time these things are upon us, rather than in dread and despair, Christ is saying, I love you so much, I'm going to share my cross with you. So that's a good way to end it. Anything? Okay.